and welcome to the Bio360 podcast. My name is Unkas Chemiker, and today we're going to talk about oxalates. What are they and how dangerous are they really? My today's guest is a nutritional therapist and functional medicine practitioner. Please welcome with me from the UK, Elliot Overton. Hi, Elliot.
Hi, Unkas. Thanks for having me on.
And I'm really happy to have you on, and I'm really happy to talk about this super interesting topic and to bring it to Germany, kind of. I mean, this is a worldwide podcast. At the moment I use the English language. Of course, everybody can listen to it, but my podcast is based in Germany. And in Germany, nobody seems to know anything about oxalates. So I make this kind of a mission. So I will kind of make a translation also of our... Not a full translation, but I will make a resume of it so I can inform people more about it. Before we jump into the topic, maybe you can tell us something about yourself. How you came to talk to that subject actually.
Okay, right. So, the topic of oxalates is a bit of a rabbit hole when you start to go down it. As I said, I am trained as a nutritionist. I'm work with people in clinical practice, try to improve their health. I try to utilize what we call functional medicine. So we try to get to the kind of root cause or investigate what is driving chronic health issues and then addressing the causes. And time again, what I have found is that the traditional kind of functional medicine interventions using various nutrients and various diets are frankly not as effective as I would like them to be or as they are purported to be. For many individuals, there is this central nutritional dogma, and this is what practically every kind of nutritionist would learn when they study, whether it go through the conventional university route or whether it be through some kind of so-called alternative route. This dogma that the more plants that you eat, the healthier you will become, right? Mm. And this is just so common, especially with many of the world-leading authorities now recommending things like plant-based diets. There is this notion, and it's really been adopted by the general population, that if we eat more plants, then we become healthier. And unfortunately, in my position, I'm in a situation where people put trust in me and they expect me to be able to provide them with advice that is going to improve their health. Now, what you often see is that whilst there are some people who benefit from plant-based diets, there are other people who, when they eat more plants, they actually get worse. They might feel better temporarily, but actually when they start increasing the load of plants, especially the so-called superfoods, which I'm sure we'll talk about later,
sure.
The more superfoods that someone eats, actually the sicker they get. And so seeing this kind of thing recur over and over, it kind of really led me to want to dig into the topic of why this actually happens. And, by chance, I stumbled across some information. I was actually doing some research on sulfur and sulfur metabolism, investigating some other kind of rabbit hole. And then actually I stumbled across this topic of oxalates. Now, I'd been kind of familiar with the concept of oxalates very superficially, you might say. But then really looking into it, I think I tapped into something, and there is a whole worldwide community and people who've been doing research in this for decades. But I tapped into something which I see is very, very, very significant, and I see it more and more and more in people in clinical practice. And that is the topic of essentially what you might think of as plant toxins or plant defense mechanisms. Now, a very basic overview is that plants have innate defenses, much like any other living organism. So, am I right in thinking that you previously interviewed Paul Saladino?
I had Paul Saladino on the show, yeah.
Right. Okay. So your audience are familiar with this concept, right? They're familiar with the concept that plants actually want to protect themselves. Well, oxalate is one of the mechanisms by which plants do that potentially, and there's also some other ways that oxalate may also benefit plants. But essentially, it's this idea that when we consume certain plant foods, they can, or we can acquire or absorb or develop some kind of an accumulation of a toxin which they produce, and this can then go on to spiral down into chronic health conditions of many different sorts. And so that is kind of what led me to research this stuff in a little bit more depth. And I don't claim to be an expert, but I do have a very keen interest in this, and I'm interested in how we can support people who do have these issues.
Yeah. Thank you for that introduction. So, you mentioned something that I wanted to pick on also. Like, I mean, we have been really educated in the last 20 years. Like, the more plants you eat, the healthier you get. Like, I mean, this is like ubiquitous. Like, everybody's saying that. You have your 5 servings or 9 servings or whatever per day of fruits and vegetables. And I've been chronically sick. I had chronic fatigue for like 6 years, and I was going vegetarian, and I was getting vegan and raw vegan and even more vegetables. And I tried even fruitarian approach, and that didn't really help me, to say at least. And so that's the question I'm asking. Like, is the promise that the more plants we eat, did that actually ever happen? Did it become true? Is this something that really that we can see clinically, or is you already gave a hint? Like, at least for some people, it's like the opposite is happening.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that previous therapeutic modalities, for instance, Gerson therapy, which is used very high levels of juices very frequently for things like cancer, I do not dispute that this has worked in certain cases. Likewise, when someone is on, let me give you an example. So many of the low-fat vegan diets, there are certain proponents who've said that they have used this diet, and I know people personally who have used a plant-based diet to actually reverse their diagnosis of cancer. Right now, that's not something I would necessarily recommend, but I know several people who have done that. And so it's no doubt that going on a plant-based diet temporarily can make people feel better. That's one thing. And it can also potentially improve their health temporarily in the short term. I don't dispute that. And now what I think is if we just use our common sense, if we look at the traditional or kind of standard Western diet, which is filtering in more towards the east now, so all throughout Europe, in certain parts of Asia, we see processed foods, fast foods, essentially foods that have been chemically altered. So when you're on a diet which is primarily processed or chemically altered food, which is pretty much depleted in nutrients, anything is going to be somewhat of an improvement on that, if temporarily, right? So someone goes from a standard diet and they remove all of the processed foods, whether that be going onto a plant-based diet, whether that be going onto any kind of other diet. If it includes whole foods, they're probably going to be increasing their nutrient intake, okay? Likewise, they're going to be reducing many of the chemicals. So it's like any deviation from the standard processed diet is probably going to provide benefits. Yeah. And so I think that oftentimes this idea that actually people increasing the plants in their diet, making them feel healthier, I really tend to think that it's actually just reducing the processed foods, which makes them feel good.
Yeah, just eating better.
Yeah, just eating more whole foods. So I think that is one of the things which really kind of underlies this this idea that people feel better when they eat lots of plants. But then what we have to understand is that there are numerous financial interests in trying to determine what we should eat as a whole kind of population. So there are billion dollar industries who are producing certain foods who want to affect public policy, food policy, telling us what is healthy and what is not healthy. And it seems that since there has been this kind of, you might call it, crusade against red meat and animal products, when you look at the authorities, generally most of the food authorities are now moving towards telling us that we need to be eating complete plant-based diets or reducing red meat intake, increasing plants. But then you've also got big biotech companies producing things like the Impossible Burger, right? You know about the Impossible Burger?
Sure. I never had one. I would never have one, but yeah.
I think it's probably, a good idea. But essentially, this is what we're moving towards. And so I honestly believe that actually there are certain, whether it be agencies or individuals right up the top of, say, the food pyramid or whatever, not to get too conspiratorial, but essentially there are people who are making a lot of money off of people moving towards more plant and grain-based diets and away from animal products. Because you see these kind of dietary recommendations, the foods are scalable. You can make a lot of money from a little bit of money. Whereas with animal products, it's kind of difficult to make that much money. Okay. So ultimately, I think that this push towards people going on plant-based diets and whatnot and increasing their plants, I think that there's financial interest involved there. But looking at some of the detrimental effects that people have on plant-based diets, is that what you're wanting to go through? Is how by increasing plants, you're increasing your exposure to these toxins, right?
Exactly. And one of these toxins, I mean, there's lectins, there's phytic acid, there's alkaloids, and one of these toxins are the oxalates, and we want to talk about this. So just quickly, you mentioned like there's an interest in that push into plants, and we just had the movie Game Changers, by James Cameron, who owns a factory for pea protein and stuff like this, So you can see it's very obvious, like there's a lot of money in that, and people want us to eat plants. And so maybe it's more about financial interest than actually really health. So let's just start from the top. Like, what on earth are oxalates?
Okay, right. So oxalates, the simple term that you can think of it, the base chemical in oxalate is oxalic acid. This is an organic acid. This is found all throughout the plant kingdom. It's made in very small amounts in the human body as well. We make it in the liver. We make oxalate in the liver as part of normal human metabolism. Again, this is in very small amounts. Oxalic acid, the way that you find it in nature, you may find some oxalic acid in its free form, but predominantly it's going to be composed as a oxalate salt. So when I'm talking about oxalate, what this means is oxalic acid is bound very tightly with a certain mineral. Okay, you can think of oxalic acid by itself. It's very corrosive. You can use oxalic acid to it's a corrosive organic acid. If you get it on your skin, it burns. It's got a very high toxicity profile. Pound by pound, it's more toxic than asbestos is. Okay, so oxalic acid is used in chemistry, and it is known as a very kind of well-established toxin. But essentially, the way that you find it predominantly in nature is it's bound with certain minerals. One of those is calcium. Another one is potassium, magnesium. It can bind with zinc, iron. It is used actually as a rust. So you might use it to get rust off of metal because it binds very strongly with iron. It can actually remove rust from rusty old metal. That you can use it as a cleaning agent. But essentially, when you find it in certain plants, it's going to be in different quantities. Now, like I said before, it's found throughout the whole plant kingdom, but it's found in certain plants more than other plants. So there are certain plant families or certain types of plants, certain types of vegetable and fruit, which contain enormously high amounts of this. Now, it's theorized that this is potentially going to be employed as a defense mechanism by a plant. And the reason for this is that when you find oxalate or oxalic acid bound with a mineral such as calcium oxalate, what it does is it forms a very strong tight bond. You can think of it like a magnet, and the way that those crystals precipitate, the mineral crystals, is as very sharp spiky objects. So you can get various shapes and sizes of oxalate crystals. You can have very, very small nanocrystals which are capable of traversing through cell membranes and all of these different other kinds of soft tissues, you also have larger crystals. You have these structures called raphides, and these are like long, spiky needles. There's also various different types of hexagonal kind of three-dimensional structures that oxalate can form in. And what this does, you can think of it like shards of glass, okay? And now if you've got a plant, primarily the oxalate is going to be found in the leaves of the plant. And what this may do in nature to protect the plant is actually by providing a mechanical stress. So you think about it, if you get a microscope to the leaves of a plant with oxalate, you can find that there are very, very, very sharp crystals. And so if there was some kind of an animal who wanted to eat that plant, when it chews down on the leaves, it liberates these sharp crystals. And what happens is then that then punctures into the soft tissues and can actually cause mechanical stress. Okay, so this is one of the ways that kind of plants stop animals from eating too much of them to then go on to reproduce and kind of protect the other family of that plant. And now what you find is that many people, or many of the foods that we eat in our modern day world, are very high in this particular kind of toxin. Okay, oxalate is extraordinarily high in certain plants such as spinach. Spinach is extraordinarily high. It's high in many of the nuts, many of the seeds, many of the so-called superfoods, Uncas, okay? So when you're looking at raw cacao powder, cacao dark chocolate is a very high food. We have various kind of Ayurvedic herbs and spices. So, for instance, cinnamon and turmeric, and we have black pepper, and we have many other vegetables. So actually many of the root vegetables, such as sweet potato, the kind of paleo-friendly vegetables, right? We see things like cassava is just very high. We have as I said, most nuts and seeds, but there's also certain green leafy vegetables, such as beet greens or Swiss chard, as I said, spinach. Maybe we could go into where it's found. I think you wanted to go into that a little bit later, but essentially what happens is when this doesn't only apply to animals, we are animals ourselves. So when we consume these foods, then we are liberating these kinds of oxalate crystals. Now, what I haven't said is that oxalate can exist in two main forms. Aside from being free oxalic acid, which you don't find much in plants, it's usually bound very tightly with a mineral. And depending on the type of mineral is going to determine whether the oxalate salt is soluble or insoluble in water. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Calcium oxalate, calcium, due to the kind of configuration of the bind between oxalate and calcium, what this means is that calcium is very insoluble in water. Okay, it's very insoluble, so you're not going to absorb much of it. Whereas you also have insoluble insoluble oxalate salts such as potassium and sodium oxalate. So whether the oxalate found in the food is soluble or insoluble is going to determine whether you absorb it into your bloodstream through the intestine. A simple way to look at it is that you can't absorb insoluble oxalate, whereas you can absorb soluble oxalate. And aside from the mechanical stress that the kind of crystals and the sharp spiky structures might be causing to the soft tissues, what I haven't said is that the body can absorb this and accumulate it. And this is really probably the main point of this whole talk, is that unlike other plant toxins that we see in nature, for instance, lectins or phytonutrients, with lectins, if someone has some kind of a digestive issue or some kind of an autoimmune issue and they're reacting to lectins, then simply abstaining from eating lectins is going to resolve that issue fairly quickly. This is where oxalate is so fundamentally different to every single one of the other potentially problematic plant compounds, because we don't react initially to oxalate. Oxalate is actually insidious. So the body accumulates it. The body doesn't accumulate lectins. It doesn't accumulate phytochemicals. It rapidly metabolizes them and it gets rid of them fairly quickly. Oxalate that doesn't happen. In fact, with oxalate, what happens is long-term chronic exposure of foods which are very, very, very high in oxalates can gradually, basically, you can think of it like the body's burden or the body's total store of oxalate starts to increase because you need to excrete it as you are absorbing it. And unfortunately, your rate of excretion oftentimes is much lower than the rate at which you're eating it if you're eating a very high diet. So the body begins to accumulate this stuff and it stores it in various different tissues. I'm sure this is something we're going to go through in a lot more depth in a minute, but essentially the body is accumulating this stuff and that it needs to get rid of it. And that can be a very gradual process. And so if someone has a problem with these kinds of oxalate stones or oxalate crystals, it can take a very long time to improve their health. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, you mentioned, so oxalates are insidious. They don't act in the same way as lectins do or phytic acid does. It's something that accumulates in the body and so that would be the next question, actually. What are the symptoms? What can we expect? What do you see clinically about it? I had a discussion with a doctor, with an MD, just a few days ago, and we talked about kidney stones. Maybe we can go into that. And he said, like, hey, I'm practicing for 30 years, you know. And by the way, he's a proponent of a vegan diet, and I'm practicing for 30 years and I've never seen a kidney stone. So what's the issue with oxalates, really?
Well, I mean, that's very interesting. I see people with kidney stones all the time. So maybe it has to do with what kind of people he's attracting in his practice. I don't know. Yeah, but essentially, when we're looking at oxalates, it can be this kind of abstract concept when we're just talking about the chemistry and the biochemistry. But for people to kind of grok what kind of effects oxalates can have, I'm sure most of your listeners know at least one person who has had or currently has kidney stones, or they may be familiar with the concept of kidney stones. They may have heard of it. Well, you can think of kidney stones as kind of the prototypical oxalate-related health condition, okay? When you look at kidney stones, basically the basic process of what a kidney stone is that certain types of crystals or large stones, which are kind of compounded crystals, deposit in the kidneys. And this can be due to kind of an accumulation of certain mineral compounds in the kidneys, and the kidneys can't necessarily keep up with the burden of the accumulation. They can't pass it. If anyone's passed a kidney stone, it is extraordinarily painful. Well, it turns out that 80% of all kidney stones, whilst you can have certain kidney stones which are primarily calcium phosphate or cysteine kidney stones, 80% of them are calcium oxalate, okay? So what that means is that the calcium oxalate crystals have built up in the kidneys, and the kidneys can't get rid of them. Now, this can actually lead to like acute renal failure, okay? You can get a blockage, but generally it causes lots of oxidative stress and lots of damage to the kidney. So when you're looking at calcium oxalate, or when you hear about oxalate or type it into Google, that is the first thing that's going to come up. Likewise, if you go onto PubMed and you type in calcium oxalate, that is where most of the research is on. And so there is this myth that calcium oxalate, the only problem that it causes in the body is that it causes kidney stones. Whereas that is absolutely, it could not be further from the truth. It really could not be. Right, so the general recommendations for someone with kidney stones is that they should go on a low oxalate diet. So it is acknowledged that a high oxalate diet, a diet which is high in certain plants which contain these toxins, can eventually accumulate to such an extent that causes the body to accumulate these crystals and cause damage to the kidneys. But what isn't understood is that actually calcium oxalate or oxalate toxicity does not only apply to the kidneys. You see, oxalate crystals can develop or they can accumulate in practically every known organ in the human body. Now, unfortunately, this hasn't been very well characterized. There is some kind of hints that we've gotten through various pieces of the literature. But it turns out that many other people have this kind of issue, but for whatever reason, it does not produce kidney stones. They may not have kidney stones, but kidney stones is a very good sign that someone does have oxalate problems. But let's just go through where oxalate can actually deposit and then what kind of symptoms that can produce. So when you absorb oxalate, so oxalate, when you're chowing down on your spinach or you're drinking your spinach smoothie, you're going to be absorbing some of the soluble oxalate and some of the free oxalic acid simply in the soft tissues, in the esophagus, in the stomach. A lot of the oxalate is absorbed in the stomach, but it's also going to be absorbed throughout the intestine. Now, when you absorb it in the intestine, it's going to be going directly to the liver. And remember, oxalic acid is toxic. You can deal with a very small amount at any one given time, but actually when you have a very high amount, it is considered an immune activating substance. So it activates the immune system and your body needs to get rid of it very quickly. So it will go from the liver, it will go to the heart, then it will go to the lungs, then it will go round the body, all throughout the body, and then it will go to the kidneys and be excreted, okay? So if you've got a high burden of oxalate or a high level of oxalate coming in from the diet, then entering into the bloodstream, it's going to be passing through various tissues before it gets out to the kidney, okay? So let's just look at some of the organs that oxalate has been found in. Well, what we know is that oxalate can deposit. It's a very strong irritant for the vascular system, okay? For the vascular system. So you think about it, you're absorbing it from the intestines. It's going out through the bloodstream, through the arterioles, through the capillaries, then out through the veins. And as it's doing so, you think of this stuff as highly corrosive, highly irritant. It can activate the inflammatory process causing endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction is where you're having insults to the blood vessels, causing a localized inflammatory response. It's what occurs in atherosclerosis, okay? Now, what's happening is that as oxalate passes through the vascular system, it causes irritation, it causes inflammation to the blood vessels. It can deposit throughout various organs, including the thyroid gland. There's some interesting information. There's one of the studies I was looking at before. It was showing that, I think it was, don't quote me on this, but it was roughly 80% of adults or females over the age of 60 have thyroid or had calcium oxalate stones in their thyroid gland. Do you think when this oxalates? Yeah, when the oxalate crystals, when they deposit in the thyroid gland or when they deposit in any tissue, they're acting on two different levels. They are producing mechanical stress due to their physical properties being sharp. Think of it like a shard of glass. But at the same time, they're also causing biochemical abnormalities. But we won't go into that just yet. But essentially what they are doing when they are depositing in an organ, they are causing inflammation. They're causing oxidative damage. And so in the thyroid gland, they're kind of one of the things that you will find is that people, if they do have oxalate deposition in the thyroid gland, then actually that is going to affect how well they're making thyroid hormones, how well they are able to produce the necessary antioxidants around the thyroid gland, how well they are able to regulate the antibody response in the thyroid gland. So actually, if someone has antibodies in the thyroid gland, you can expect they probably have autoantibodies against that tissue. Okay, that is very common. What you also have, though, is you have it depositing in joints. And when it deposits in joints, it deposits in the cartilage and the soft tissues, the connective tissues around the joints. And it's affecting these things called glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans, which allow the joints to be, you can think of them as fluid and move over one another in a nice, smooth way. And so actually one of the things that you see very often, one of the key symptoms of oxalate problems is unexplained joint pain. Okay. Now, there is actually a condition in the literature referred to as oxalate-related arthropathy. So it is acknowledged by certain scientists that oxalate can cause symptoms which practically completely mimic arthritis. But there is no autoimmune process going on. So the body is not attacking its own joints like you would see in rheumatoid arthritis. What is actually happening is that the oxalate crystals being deposited, being sharp, being spiky, causing inflammation, causing oxidative stress, these people may have symptoms very similar to kind of asymmetric or symmetric arthritis, but not get the diagnosis. And their doctors may be left thinking, well, okay, you haven't got arthritis, but you've got something and we don't know how to treat it. This is very common. Likewise, you can have it deposit in the muscles. When it goes to the muscles, there you get muscle pain, much like fibromyalgia. In fact, many people I've tested with fibromyalgia actually have very high levels of urinary oxalic acid. Okay.
Very interesting.
So I think it is a key driver of many people's fibromyalgia, and there are lots of people who find that when they reduce oxalate in the diet, they actually see a benefit with their fibromyalgic pain. But again, much like in the joints, it's causing pain in the muscles. Now, it can go throughout the neurological system, and when it deposits in the nerves, it can actually irritate the nerves, cause damage to the neurological system, and affect how you are processing nerve signals. So you can end up with kind of weird neuropathy symptoms, weird nerve pain, neurological dysfunction kind of thing. This is, again, very common. One thing that I haven't said is that oxalate, like we were talking about before, you think of it like a magnet. It's a magnet for certain minerals. So when you absorb this stuff, if it's in its insoluble form, has a very high affinity for calcium. So when it's traveling out throughout the bloodstream, you have to understand that in your blood, you have an abundance of minerals. You have iron, you have zinc, you have calcium, phosphate, magnesium, potassium, sodium. So your blood is a dense reservoir of minerals. And if you have oxalic acid, if it's bound with some kind of, say it's bound with potassium and it's traveling through the blood, because of its kind of, you think of it like its dense negative charge, it has a very high, it really likes calcium. So what it will do is it will tend towards binding with calcium over any other mineral. And this is how you're getting these stones precipitate in certain tissues, is because you have the flow of blood. If you have elevated soluble oxalate or free oxalic acid in the blood, then you are going to end up with the transfer of the oxalate towards calcium, and then as that becomes insoluble, that is going to precipitate and stick in various tissues. But essentially, oxalate has been related, or to come back to your question, in short, the types of health conditions, generally what we are seeing is pain. We are seeing any joint pain. If we look at the kind of the transport of oxalate, we know it's important in kidney function and kidney stones. So if someone's had kidney stones and they are oxalate related, which most of the time they are, generally they have a problem with this kind of toxin. But what you also see is that as the kidneys are excreting this stuff, as it's excreting it, it needs to go into the bladder and then out through the urinary tract. Okay, so one of the kind of primary ways that this was publicized to the public was an individual who's doing research on vulvar pain, or a condition called vulvodynia. Vulvodynia is essentially where the soft tissues around the genitalia of the vagina in a female are unexplainably causing pain. So this can feel like shards of glass in the labia or in the vagina or on the outside of the vagina, and cause women lots of pain. And there's not really that many explanations for why it occurs. Well, what this one individual who actually created the Vulva Pain Foundation, she found that actually oxalates were highly implicated in this condition, and when she went on a low oxalate diet, that actually it improved it wonderfully. And so what is happening is, as oxalate stones or crystals, nanocrystals and things are being passed out through the urine, then you're having as I said, it's corrosive. So what it's doing is it's damaging the urinary tract. You can cause micro tears in the urinary tract. You can cause micro tears in the bladder. So one of the things that you see very often is people having unexplained UTIs, so chronic urinary tract infections. Or what you also see is that people have UTI-like symptoms such as interstitial cystitis, but there is no acknowledgeable infection. They may go to the doctor again and again, and they will culture for some kind of a bacteria, usually E. coli, yet there will be no bacteria which is grown. And so the doctor may prophylactically prescribe antibiotics to improve that, but they will not see a benefit, because the problem is not necessarily an infection per se. It is that you have these crystals coming out of the urinary tract, carving away at the bladder, getting lodged in the bladder, and then also coming down and penetrating into the soft tissues, causing pain, feeling like shards of glass, causing kind of frequent urination, blood in the urine, painful urination, all of these kind of urinary symptoms. It can also affect the gut as well, though, and this is something important. As I said before, most of the oxalate is absorbed in the intestines, but you also have some being absorbed in the stomach. But as it's lodging into the soft tissues throughout the esophagus and in the upper stomach, you can actually have what is referred to, or what it kind of mimics like a neurological impairment of the sphincters. Okay, so when you have neurological impairment of the enteric nervous system, the enteric nerves can't fire properly. They're unable to fire. And so essentially you can develop things like acid reflux or dysmotility, because what it's doing is it's temporarily paralyzing the nervous system in the gut, which is responsible for contracting and making sure all of the sphincters are closed at the right time, allowing you to gastric empty, so empty the contents of the stomach into the upper intestine. And then also is involved in how well you're propelling food throughout the intestine to effectively digest it and eliminate it in proper ways. So again, I could talk for hours on just this one topic, but essentially it has been found to lodge into the aorta, for instance, in the heart. It's been found in the heart. It can disrupt mineral balance. Remember I said that it was a mineral chelator. So it's a magnet for certain minerals. And for your cells to properly function, especially nerves, there's something called the sodium-potassium pump. So the balance of minerals inside and outside the cell is extraordinarily important for how the cell is passing messages, but also how the cell is actually functioning. And so what we see in kind of in organs which are governed by the nervous system, when there is excess oxalate present, it's affecting the mineral balance inside and outside of the cells, which is then going on to affect how well messages are sent from, say, the brain through the autonomic nervous system to the organs such as the heart. And you can end up with kind of weird type arrhythmias and other kinds of unexplainable abnormalities related to certain organ function. I'll just reel off a couple of other health conditions which have been found to be associated with oxalate, because it is very interesting. It has been associated with potentially with autism, so it can lodge in the brain, can lodge behind the eyes, can come out of the skin. It's been found in the thyroid gland, as I've said, but it's also been found to disrupt the liver function, liver metabolism, in the kidneys, as we see. Again, it's been associated in the gut as well. You can think of these sharp crystals traveling through the gut, being very corrosive, causing mechanical stress, actually tearing away at the gut lining. So it has been implicated in peptic ulcers, in Crohn's disease, and many different kinds of gut dysfunction. I find that when people reduce oxalates in the diet, their guts generally tend to improve significantly. But also
could that be a reason for leaky gut?
Well, indeed, yeah. What has been found in the kidneys is to disrupt certain proteins called occludin. Now, these are effectively the same proteins which are responsible for maintaining the tight junctions in the intestine, along with zonulin. So actually, what we find is that it does affect those kind of proteins in the kidney. What I suspect is that it does potentially cause leaky gut as well when you have excess present. Now, there's an important thing to note here, though, is that generally, whilst oxalate can be implicated in kind of causing gut issues, I think elevated oxalate absorption is more likely to be a consequence of gut issues. So what I haven't spoken about, I've spoken about how kind of you're absorbing it and all of this kind of stuff. essentially, not everyone is going to be absorbing the same amount. So one person...
Before we go into absorption, let's have a break here. Because we already, that was quite a blast. That's so interesting to listen to you, and I'm actually learning a lot, and I already have dove into this topic quite a bit. So you mentioned like a million things. Like that's like the question I'm asking. Like, is there anything that's not related or could not be related to oxalates? You seem to have mentioned like every tissue, every function in the body.
Yeah, right. I'm going to be honest. A lot of understanding of oxalate problems comes from literature, either on kidney stones, but actually one of the most important areas of literature is on a condition called primary hyperoxaluria. So you remember I was saying that the body can actually make its own oxalates under certain conditions in the liver. Well, some people have a very rare genetic defect, which means that they produce excess amounts all of the time. Okay. Now, what happens in these individuals is we see oxalate deposits in almost every single tissue, or many different tissues. So what we can surmise from that is that if someone has this kind of issue of a very high oxalate diet, they are absorbing excessive amounts through a condition called enteric hyperoxaluria, then essentially what you are ending up with is, I personally believe, and many other people believe, that you can produce a very similar situation. And so to answer your question, I don't think there is anything that is not potentially related to oxalate. Because if you look at this, it's an inherent toxin, right? Now, it's not a toxin in the sense of mercury or lead or cadmium, but essentially, when in high amounts, it is extremely toxic. And so if it gets to one of your tissues, then it is inevitably going to cause stress and damage. It's an under-researched topic, and I don't like to paint everything with the same brush. What I will say is that I'm confident that it could probably contribute to any known health condition.
Okay, all right. So we call it a day for this part of the episode, and we're going to talk more about it and going to dive into the cell, mitochondria, and of course we're going to dive into like more the practical aspects of it, which foods contain it, and what to do, can we mitigate it, and everything else. So thank you for being on the show, and see you back in the next part. Thank you, Elliot.
Excellent.
You are certainly aware of the fact that our sleep is probably the most important factor when it comes to health and regeneration. A good sleep is key for energy production, detoxification, brain health, and a lot more. The Oura Ring is probably the world's best sleep tracker. It's a tiny little ring that can track your deep sleep, your REM sleep, and even sophisticated parameters like night HRV and body temperature. I was able to identify a couple of sleep-related problems for myself and solve them with the help of the Oura Ring. The ring comes with a built-in airplane mode and does not emit any visible light during the night like some popular wristbands or smartwatches do. I simply love my Oura Ring. And the best part is, listeners of the Virus 360 podcast now get a whopping $50 off. The only thing you got to do is follow the link in the description of the podcast, and the discount will be applied in the final checkout step. Sleep well.